Today we are going to show you how to make a yeast starter. A starter is basically a mini batch of beer that allows your yeast to wake up and start multiplying before you brew. Pitching the starter into your unfermented beer instead of yeast alone will help to create a faster and healthier fermentation because the yeast will be awake and more active. Here are some of the things you will need. Plain light dry malt extract, about 4 to 6 ounces. A kitchen scale. Sanitizing solution. A 1 liter Erlenmeyer flask. A small piece of tin foil. And a bowl that is tall enough to hold water up to about the 1 liter mark on the flask. And of course, the yeast you plan on using for your beer. You can see the solid mass of yeast. Right now it's cold and the yeast is dormant. Make sure to take it out of the fridge 3 hours before you start. First we're going to put the Erlenmeyer flask in the sink. Grab some sanitizing solution and put it in the flask. Add warm water and stir. Let that sit for a few minutes while we move on. Next, measure out 6 ounces of dry malt extract using a kitchen scale. It's best to use plain light malt for the starter as it will not affect the taste of whatever beer style you're brewing. We like to use a paper plate to get the malt in the flask easier. Pour slowly as the finely powdered dry malt can easily spill. You only need about 6 ounces, but that's more of a guideline than a rule. Once you measure out the malt, it's time to get it into the clean flask. For this, we like to use a rolled up paper plate. Roll it up into a funnel shape and insert it into the top of the flask. It works better than most funnels because it doesn't clog up. Take your dry malt and carefully pour it into the top of the flask. Head back to the sink and add cold water to the flask. Start stirring to mix things up. You want to fill the flask to the 1 liter mark. Now it's time to brew the mini batch of beer on the stove. Use the smallest burner your stove has. Remember, hot glass looks just like cold glass, so double check before picking the flask up. You'll want to heat and stir the mixture now until it reaches boiling. You'll see the malt floating around in the water right now. You will notice the mixture darken as it reaches boiling. The foam on the top will increase. Pay attention to this to prevent boilovers. Take a small piece of tin foil and use it to make a lid on top of the flask. This will help the starter reach the boiling point faster. Remember to leave a path for the steam to escape up and out of the flask. As it starts to boil, you will see some foam rise up from the flask. Turn off the burner if needed to prevent a boilover. Let the mixture boil for at least 20 minutes. While it is boiling, head back to the sink and prepare to cool the starter. Place the bowl in the sink and add hot water. Hot water is used instead of cold water at first, so the glass does not shock and break. Grab the starter from the stove when it is done boiling and place it in the bowl of hot water. Be sure to leave an opening for the heat to escape, but don't let any water into the flask. Run cold water into the bowl and let it circulate around the flask. This should cool the starter in about 10 to 20 minutes. You can place a temperature probe into the starter to know for sure when it is ready when it reaches a temperature of 70 degrees Fahrenheit. We like to use a stir plate to continually stir and suspend the yeast in the starter so they have access to more food and grow quicker and healthier. Our homemade stir plate uses a variable power supply to control the speed of a computer fan with magnets glued to it. The revolving magnets create an electromagnetic field which spins a Teflon-coated stir bar that is placed inside of the flask. This allows us to stir the starter in a sanitary way. Typically, an airlock is used to let CO2 escape and keep the bad things out of the starter. We use a foam plug that lets oxygen in and keeps the bad stuff out. When the starter has cooled, add the sanitized stir bar and place the flask on the magnetic stir plate. Adjust the speed of the stir plate until you have a tornado spinning effect in the flask. Now it's time to add the yeast. Shake up the yeast until the liquid and solid mix together. Carefully open the container to slowly release the trapped carbon dioxide. Now, pitch the yeast into the starter. Grab your foam stopper and compress it to fit into the neck of the flask. Let the starter sit for 12 to 24 hours before you plan on brewing. Pour the entire 1 liter starter into your unfermented beer in place of the yeast. The yeast in the starter will be awake and immediately start to ferment the freshly brewed beer. You should start to see signs of fermentation in just 12 to 24 hours instead of the typical 24 to 48 hours when not using a starter. The beer should also finish primary fermentation quicker. A faster start to fermentation means your beer will be healthier and have less chance for harmful bacteria and other undesirable organisms to grow in it. Try making one batch of beer with a starter and one without. You'll see the difference in fermentation speed, and there's a good chance that your beer will turn out even more delicious. Cheers, and happy brewing from all of us at Blackheart Brewery.